Jenny, thanks for the warm welcome and the introduction. And before I get started, I just want to say big thanks to you, Jenny, for if you've gone and seen the work at the show, you'll see that it's digital prints of my work. And so basically, I sent over a lot of files, and then Jenny did all the work to print them, frame them, make the exhibition, and then Katie, also thanks to you for them both hanging them. So I really did a minimal part in this exhibit, but I'm honored to be here. And this is the second time that I've shown with both of you at the Saranac. So thanks again for inviting me. Once again, it's always fun and a pleasure. So I'll pull up my PowerPoint here, and can everybody see this okay? Okay, so the work that I am displaying at the gallery is really a collection of preliminary works that I made to create a body of larger oil paintings really over the last year. And if you haven't seen any of my work before, I think the threads that are like a continual kind of theme in my work are they're narratives that really let dynamics of, like power dynamics and social conflict play out, and recurringly more in natural landscapes. So I'm really interested in social inequality and making work that speaks to the contemporary human condition and acknowledges some of the absurd effects of late stage capitalism. So this piece, the painting is titled Red Threat, and this is the collage that I made for that. So here it's a watercolor made in basically a watercolor sketchbook, and I've included clippings of a forest fire, multiple forest fire scenes from magazines that I keep around in my studio. I get magazines from the library as they're discarding them, and I think a lot of the images from this are kind of from more politically science-oriented magazines. And at the time, or actually this was just after coming out of the shutdown, being cooped up in the pandemic, and then throughout the spring, I remember just watching the news and seeing the forest fires in the West are progressing and getting worse and worse every year. And so I was thinking about that. And then they had a segment that was talking about vigilante justice people going out and trying to find the Antifa people who are starting the forest fires and accosting people with their guns as they're trying to, evacuate. So I was pretty alarmed by that. And I think that's, where the work came from. I guess when I'm making these collages, one benefit is that I kind of just see what I'm interested in and try to see where the narrative goes. But as you can see, yeah, it's got this forest fire scene. I think this is a man kind of gassing up a car in what I think is Cuba with one of these old boat cars. There's a couple of North Korean soldiers here who were taking notes from Kim Jong-un in this magazine clipping. And then this is like an old hunting advertisement. And I was really thinking about color, the color red, as a formal element to tie all of these things together, but also just to talk about the social dynamics of the time. Obviously, like red, sort of symbolizes communism, and I would say North Korea and China, but also the Republican Party. And then I wanted this kind of feeling of heat and fire and anger, really. And so you can see how in the painting I've used the digital collage as ways to progress my painting, to not only like make these narratives that have the illusion of, a traditional landscape space, but also to complicate that space. So I've highlighted that where you can see sort of the tears of the paper or the cut, the digital cut from the tool. And then most notably with this one, I accidentally hit my mute, sorry. With this one, the sort of caricature of hate speech here that was originally drawn, with a pen tool and a digital tablet, and then translated into using an actual tube of paint to kind of recreate that mark in a textural mark. This piece is called Thirst Trappin', and it's a smaller watercolor on a watercolor block. And it was inspired by when I was traveling in Portugal, I think is where I took this photo. And I guess traveling in Europe, just there's the billboard advertisements are very glamorous. And there's also a lot of glamorous people in certain instances, but then there's also sort of, I guess what I wanted to showcase with this one is that sort of class dynamic, and maybe also contrasting the ideas of beauty with the three figures in here. So there's the billboard advertisement, obviously, in the background, and that comes from a gel medium transfer. And then I've painted in the other two figures sort of casually walking by. And then you can see a figure on the who was laying on the sidewalk, sort of sleeping, a homeless person trying to catch some rest in the daytime. This piece is called Pyramid, and I've started to do some drawing on my digital on my iPad and explore that a little bit. And I was surprised when I started working with it that it actually does do fairly well just in simulating the way I like to draw with graphite. And in terms of the imagery here, it's really most all the figures are taken from just some people watching I was doing when I was in Barcelona at a beach. And then I've sort of interjected them into this desert landscape, which I believe is somewhere around Vegas, around the Hoover Dam. But with the title, I wanted to reference the composition that I believe is sort of a classical type of composition, the pyramid here, and then I guess draw attention to my use of the transmission towers, the big power line towers there, and maybe I guess to use those to take away from the kind of picturesque notion of the beach, but wanting to just kind of create this tension between the types of leisurely activities that we spend that we do when we're you know at the beach or experiencing tourism. And a lot of my images have started to juxtapose that kind of mundane or that like leisurely activity against natural disaster. This piece is called Milkmaid. I don't really know entirely what it's about. It was made pretty quickly. It's a reference to Vermeer in a way. These figures that I took, they definitely aren't from a Vermeer painting. I think it was from some sort of play from a theatrical magazine, but it did remind me of Vermeer's painting The Milkmaid. And so I've incorporated the window here, you can see, but I also made this woman appear to be sort of pregnant and maybe giving birth or doing something over here. And then there's this guy who looks like he's about ready to catch it. And then this other guy squirting a bottle of perfume at her. And all of this is happening atop a Harley Davidson motorcycle. And so I was thinking about it last night when I was trying to figure out what I'm going to say about this, but I guess, I'm in Pennsylvania now, and in Gettysburg, one of the big things that happens in the summer that's real annoying to me is the biker gangs come through town. We have something called Bike Week, and it's like a week nonstop of not being able to walk on the sidewalk because the overabundance of basically flatulence from the exhaust of the motorcycles like taking over the town. And I guess another thing that sort of comes out of it is making that contrast and talking about class. Maybe it's about polite society and the dynamic there. And that's something that's really an interesting dynamic to me in working here, is that we're a small liberal arts college where I teach, and it's definitely a very small test tube. And then when you walk off of campus anywhere, it's immediately like Confederate flags, on top of hamburgers, selling the Civil War to tourists who are oftentimes, people maybe from all walks of life, but I feel like more often than not from the sort of Southern mentality. So This is a collage, digital collage, and I made it for a large painting called Grave Digger Atom Splitter. And I guess as the pandemic was setting in, I started to shift my palette of my paintings to a much darker tone. And I wanted to intentionally explore more of like a moonlit or a nighttime um, type of lighting quality, because I realized a lot of the painting I had been doing was recurringly these bright sunlit beach scenes with blue skies and things like that. And so I really wanted to branch out there, but also I was interested in, I guess, commenting or playing around visually with the idea of how something maybe even ordinary could become um, morose in a way just because of the changing of the light quality. So this actually is a dirt racetrack that I photographed that's in what's called Atomic City, Idaho. And it's I don't know, out in the middle of nowhere. There's a small, like one of the first nuclear power plants, I guess, is out there in the middle of the Idaho desert. And there's a bunch of interesting stuff is what drew me to check it out. But Atomic City is basically about 10 trailer homes and then this old dirt racetrack with a bunch of junked out cars. And I just thought it was really neat. Actually, the scene I photographed in the daytime and then dragged the levels down and messed with it in Photoshop to try to make it look like a nighttime scene. And then I incorporated these figures that I just found from a Google search by just searching for Gravedigger. And I wanted to, um, you know, change the scene into something about these people digging a grave at night. And so that brings me to this piece, which is I actually modeled for this myself. I asked my landlord if they'd let me dig a hole at night in the backyard, and I brought out some photography lights, and I think I had a couple of whiskeys and was like, "Do you mind if I dig a hole in your yard?" And they were cool with it. And then my neighbor the next day was like, "Hey, what were you doing last night?" But I wanted to pose this photo shoot to get some multiple shots for a painting, and taking that idea a little another step farther in that the act of digging a hole with the shovel in the dirt, there's nothing necessarily morose about it until it starts to take shape in this nighttime landscape, and these other certain visual cues that can make us think about it as murder, or something nefarious. So and this is, again, is a drawing just on the digital tablet. As I was moving into these paintings, something I've struggled with a little bit is like, it takes a long time to make a big painting, and I'm wanting my work to be a bit more spontaneous. Um, but at the same time, usually I do a lot of careful upfront planning to know exactly what's going to go on the canvas. And I've definitely tried to move away from that, especially this last semester, but it did leave me feeling at times like I don't know if I've made a good painting or not, or if it's actually helping me. But yeah, so I did a couple of quick digital sketches. And I think the other thing that I was thinking about with this is you can see the numbers there. And I incorporated that as a title of the painting. It's called Subject 03693 Start the Dig. And the numbers basically just come from the file name on my digital camera for that particular picture. So I originally wrote them down just to be able to remember which image of me digging I wanted to draw. But I also like I guess something else that was important was I, was looking at making this series of um, bringing it down to the basics, and having it be about the task and not about it being a portrait of me. So that's why I wore white shirt, blue jeans, and then with the number in the title, Subject 03693, I wanted it to be a bit dehumanizing, which maybe speaks to some of what's happened throughout the pandemic, but maybe the prison industrial complex, and make some illusions like that. This piece is a watercolor, and it's called Mirror Stage. I made this, painted it on the train while I was traveling around in Europe, and it was inspired by this. I forget what it's called, but it's a monastery basically in Portugal, near Lisbon. And while I was there, I was just sort of people watching, and I was struck by how much people were experiencing this like beautiful, gorgeous architecture and landscape and everything like almost entirely through their phone. And meanwhile, they were doing that, I was doing the same thing because I was just obsessively on my phone trying to take pictures of them taking pictures of themselves with their phones. Um, but yeah, it did make me really think about like how mitigated our experience has become. You know, when you're experiencing something firsthand, it seems like people aren't maybe even seeing much of it, or they're only experiencing it actually 15 or something percent, and the rest of it is trying to capture it and save it for later or use it as a selfie for whatever. But the title piece, Mirror Stage, is a reference to Lacan, and the mirror stage is a philosophy of Lacan's that is about it marks the act of a child's recognition of themselves in the mirror. And so um, really talking about that first moment as an individual, I guess it happens when you're 6 to 18 months, you first see yourself in the mirror and conceptualize yourself as I. So I guess the birth of the ego. And I think it's sort of fitting for this because everybody's, I guess, using their iPhones. Um, And this piece is called Threshold. I decided to show the painting first so I could end on a work that's actually in the show. But this piece is titled Threshold. It's oil on linen, and it's, what is it, 40 by 60 inches. So it's a little bit larger than a life-size figure. And with this one, I was really interested in presenting this figure bisected by light. And that's what the title really references here, is that this figure is caught in between two spaces, light and dark, and maybe a space between reality and what's beyond the reality that we know. And so yeah, I've represented that by working with my model to take this photograph out. We used the big white tents that we had on campus. I thought were sort of oppressive and interesting, so I scheduled some photo shoots around that. And I actually had my model lay down on a table and then had another person shine a flashlight, and where the shadow from the tent cut across the figure is really what I was trying to showcase. And then in terms of bringing it into the painting, the other thing I was interested with this is the kind of void that the figure is moving into, being a bit of a reference to abstract expressionism in the paintings of like Franz Klein and whatnot, which I've always sort of liked that kind of mass gesture of abstract painting, um, and want to make references to it in my work. So I think that's what that sort of stands for. And then in terms of the digital collage, you could see how I've used that to sort of create the scene where I've done a drawing, and then I've actually, you know, on the left here, you can see I made a digital mock-up, even with this blown out photograph, and then taken another picture of the painting for the mark. And then the clouds in the sky actually came in quite a bit later. That's what this collage on the left here is for, digital collage. And then on the right, you can see that's just a version of the underpainting that I used to sort of put all of this together. So that's all that concludes my artist talk for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Austin. I do have some questions, but I'm going to save them till the end.
Okay.
Yeah, because yeah. I do particularly, I just wanted to point out like the milkmaid piece. I sort of see the figure that's sort of braced for something. He's like, he's going to dive in. He's on he's diving in. He's not necessarily catching anything, but he's ready to take a plunge.
It's definitely absurd and maybe borderlining on the perverse a little bit, you know. And personally, I like to use my artwork to talk around those issues because maybe I shy away from it a little bit, you know, when it comes to like owning up to it. But there is supposed to be a sexual tension there and a perversity to it. And maybe it's hard to explain, but
Yeah, I think your work, I think I think there's some layers of human, almost despicable human behavior that's sort of in your work that you're kind of skirting around a little bit when you talk about it.
Oh, I feel like I'm getting therapy.
Anyway, well, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Katie Creyts. And Katie, why don't you go ahead, and you should be able to share your screen, and you can take it away.
Just one sec. Great. Hello, everyone. Let me get myself started here. I'm assuming you can see that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. So I also want to thank Jenny. I know that that putting together a show on top of being department chair, on top of everything, is just a lot, and it is I don't know, I'm grateful for this opportunity, because I also think that this work is prescient to what's going on. So it's nice to have kind of like the opening up of our lives again, and having this work as a center point, a place where people can come together, and also to the people in the room who are Saranac members, you know, keeping that gallery space going. And also Melissa Huggins is here, and I want to thank her and her work with Spokane Arts, because the work that I did was sponsored by a Saga grant. So I am grateful for that support. So with my work, you can see the title of my talk is Entangled Empathy, because I'm an animal empath, like to the point where I can't clip my dog's nails. I had to take her in today to get them clipped, and I was like, it gave me like a panic attack. But it's something that I'm supposed to be doing. It's part of having a domesticated, cute, fuzzy pet, although my dog isn't necessarily cute. But so I explore what it means to be wild versus domestic, and kind of the interstitial spaces in there. And I wanted, with this grant, to explore the history of animal domestication, and also loop that into zoonotic diseases. So sort of like pandemic variety diseases that pass from animals. So you can see in this particular piece, this watercolor, I'm kind of playing around with the paisley motif being like microbial matter, and the wolf and the crane fable by Aesop of, you know, the wolf is wants to get the bone out of its throat, and commissions the crane to do it for payment. And in the end, the payment is that the wolf didn't eat the crane. But in this version, it's sort of like the crane just gave him COVID. So kind of like playing around with, well, there are these different cause and effects now. So maybe the fairy tales and fables change a little. And I didn't read the article, but I just saw something about also the coronavirus, or strains of the coronavirus, being carried in dogs. So I'm curious to read about that. But this all kind of started from all these headlines. Pangolins found to carry related strain, tiger at zoo test positive, you know, 11 deadly species, diseases hop across species, and that we're kind of situated within a multi-species context. But we're, you know, we have our exceptionalism as humans that sometimes drives us to a tale of consequence, right? So let me go here. So the first thing I did for my research, and I wasn't planning on reading this book, and I know it's a bad image, was to listen to the audio book Spillover by David Quammen. And I was really fascinated by this book. It's kind of written for the layman. He goes on he just does a lot of research on not on pandemics, but on zoonotic diseases. And he travels from continent to continent and works with different pathologists and epidemiologists and vet type people on exploring what happens with animals and how it crosses over. So I learned some new vocabulary. So a reservoir host is an animal like a bird or a bat that just sits with these microbials and is just fine with them. But then they come into contact with some amplifier species, like in the image on the left, there's a mosquito as an amplifier or a vector host. And those spread the diseases around. They don't carry well with them. They don't sit in them. They go everywhere. So kind of, he does this, this kind of amazing storytelling too. He's quite the raconteur. So I just really got into this book, but the book starts with, in Australia, with death of a horse from Hendra, where a vet is called in and the vet gets Hendra virus. And, they do like they run back to how this could have happened, and it's traced back to fruit-eating bats and the horses eating the grass beneath the fruit tree where the bat pooped, and ends up in a sort of pandemic, not too big with Hendra, but still existing. So, but our animals, for service or sport, move from continent to continent. They're domesticated for particular functions and don't necessarily have immunity to the viruses of the ecology where they are placed. So we have these things happening. So I was fascinated by this, but I also read this book called God, Man, and Domesticated Animals, which is sort of on the biblical side of animal domestication, sheep and goats primarily, and the different kind of relationships and how that's built. So like I learned terms like lead follow relationship that makes sheep and goats especially good for shepherds. They kind of want to go where their shepherd person goes, and they do that in their herds and flock systems too. They have flock boundaries where if they meet up with another flock, they will not they won't get confused and stay with the wrong flock. They'll go back home to their home boundary. They do this thing called imprinting when they're born, and which means the ewe and the baby have this fierce bond and they know each other really well. And this usually in the wild happens in their home range. But in domestication, it gets kind of confusing because there are so many packed in, and also the shepherd gets involved. He kind of grabs them and tries to imprint himself on them too, so that the ewe will give her milk to him. So there's just all these interesting things that but they get kind of messy, maybe in not as human of an Austen kind of way that I think Jenny was getting at, but it is a little despicable, like some of the things they do to the animals to get them to be domesticated. The males, of course, are culled, so they don't have much of an existence after they are of meat year, and then the females are kept around to produce offspring. And the weird thing that happens with the sheep and goats is that in the wild they have the rams have a season where they mate, but in domestication, they want to mate all the time. So they have to be separated out. The kind of stud male is always separated. So there's these weird things that happen that I thought were kind of interesting and led to some ideas in the work. So this one is, the word Dierentuin is Dutch for zoo. So this is me kind of exploring a variety of zoo type animals that lead to both domestic and wild, that lead to kind of they're like amplifier animals or reservoir hosts. So they're especially susceptible to viruses. And you can see the kind of corner of the Delft pattern makes like a little coronavirus kind of virus thing. So I made this is made out of glass, fused glass that's etched in like a cameo process. So each one of those squares was its own. Now they're all fused down to this, to a piece of glass underneath. And I use a Delft pattern. It's a motif I've used in other work to express kind of colonial landscape. It's kind of flourishy, and it's not necessarily that it has like a really delicate touch to it, but to me it kind of speaks to Dutch colonialism, and I grew up with it. It's like all over my mother's living room. So that kind of pulled me in. When I did some work based on things I had experienced in South Africa, I used the Delft pattern as well, because I wasn't sure what I could, I felt like it was mine, like it's part of my heritage. So I just came across some like weird images when I was looking at domestication and animal husbandry. Like, I guess medieval images are just kind of weird anyway. But I kind of liked these super fuzzy goats and super soft rock, which kind of led me to looking at some flora and fauna and kind of creating this sort of strangely kind of medieval-ish sort of landscape with the ram meeting up with the little baby domesticated sheep. And the little sheep, the lambs, kind of look like they are, I don't know, innocent, but really they are probably going to infect him with some kind of horrendous disease that his lungs will fill up with goop and he will die. But in the meantime, before they meet, it's very kind of bucolic. And I was kind of playing around with that idea. So, and just the weird, like some of the weird plant motifs that I saw in medieval paintings. Ooh, I went too fast. Maybe that image is big. Is it gonna stay there? Okay, so also there is the story of the bellwether in the research that I did. The bellwether is the castrated ram. The castrated ram is similar, and the parallel was made in the book to the idea of a eunuch. So the eunuch does the king's bidding. The bellwether does the shepherd's bidding when the sheep won't follow. So the sheep don't like to go in water. And so the bellwether is trained to do this. And he is, raised and coddled and trained and fed and worth a lot. Like, bellwethers get stolen because they have skills. But they kind of get the sheep to do things that they wouldn't do, which is also a weird thing. So in a fairy tale kind of way, I played with this idea of the bellwether, kind of getting these sheep to jump off a bridge and float down a river. But I also get to play with glass and try all these different things, which, was part of the grant, which was really exciting to me, just to have a bunch of glass to play with. And to explore textures and transparency and opacity. So that's the bellwether. And then habitat, you see that Delft pattern coming back in this in some of the rocks, and you also see some fencing. So some of the problems with some of the things that cause, I should say, zoonotic diseases are the things that we have done to the landscape, fences, railroad, just the way walls, all of these kinds of things, rails also cause animals to not be able to move through space. So also climate change, just stressing the ecology, loss of habitat to housing, so this is kind of like taking those basalt rocks and turning them into that domesticated landscape through using fence patterns. Some of them I laid the fence on top and then dusted it with glass powder and fired it. Other ones I etched in, like you can see the wire fence on the rock in front was etched in, and maybe at the yellow-green rock in the front also, it has like a clear fence on it that was made from a digital image. But they're all kind of that cameo process. That's habitat. Then I wanted to show just a real quick video. Hopefully it'll work. Can you see the screen?
Our first shoe was simple, it was beautiful. It was, as we say, the right amount of nothing. And then we...
Can you see the screen?
So, yeah,
We can see it.
Okay. They don't really know what to do. They run, but they don't really jump. So they're totally confused. And this fence just makes great noise too. So they'll kind of try to sneak under. Okay, so in my, back here, in my kind of COVID YouTube watching time, I got real sad watching antelope try to go under fences. So that inspired me to put some of these plastic like onion bags on a ooh, I think that's still going. Sorry, let me get to that.
But recent research.
Here we'll go big again. I want to play from current slide. Okay, so that inspired me to put these kind of things that I had. I always saved these plastic bags and just put them on a photocopier and put watercolor paper in the photocopier and just copied them onto there and then watercolored in the antelope interacting with them. And the titles are from Home on the Range. And I feel like the range is kind of a very difficult place now for the species that run, that are wild. So these are the three. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let me stop sharing here.
Well, I have one thing because I bothered Austin a little bit, so I'll bother you a little bit before we move on. But the bellwether piece, I'm just curious because, you know, throughout this whole year, we've heard the rhetoric of sheep. Oh, they're just sheep. And like it was either used as a term that COVID non-believers, I don't actually even know. I just know that it was a term being thrown around, this idea that that, oh, you're just sheep because you believe that the COVID pandemic is actually happening. Was that at all also in your mind, back of your mind, with the idea of the bellwether, this like figure that people follow, but of course we all know that followers exist on both spectrums of the sort of political divide. But I was just wondering if that was at all in your like in the back of your head somewhere when you were making this work.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like Christianity and you know, the bellwether is like the Christ follower, like, and we have that brewery in town, you know, this kind of this sort of idealized, but it's just a really weird situation too. So, you know, like, could Trump be likened to a bellwether? Of course, you know, and that we all would just jump off the bridge, or a group of us may jump off the bridge and follow, you know, someone who, and not really know what we are following, is a good metaphor. So yeah, I had those ideas when I was making it in mind, but I didn't want to depict anything that was more than the narrative that just allowed people to interpret. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
All
right. All right. Well, we don't have too much time, so I'm gonna kind of really go fast through my presentation. I have spoken about this work before that maybe some of you have heard or not heard. I have actually two pieces in the show. They're very different. They might not even relate, but they're in there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is where we are. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the new work that I have in this show. And this was work that was all developed in this past year, and of course was a direct response to the things that were going on in this past year, which of course includes the pandemic, but also includes Black Lives Matter, and also just includes the time that we all had to be with ourselves and maybe be with people or not people or whatnot. I just think that there was like an interesting sort of introspective time that that we don't necessarily get when we're just living day to day. And in fact, that there is some benefit to it. There was some benefit, at least in my mind, there was like some benefit to the sort of disruption that occurred when we had to stay home, when we got to work from home, and so forth. So these images are all digital collage to the most part, and all the imagery is created with a photo scanner. So every aspect, the hands being scanned, the objects being scanned, and then also the backgrounds were also produced with a series with just experimenting with different scanning wet things and then putting them all together sort of in Photoshop carefully and manipulating color and so forth. It's interesting because I come from a drawing and painting background. I feel like these pieces are the most painterly things I've done in a really long time, just in terms of thinking about color, pulling things in and out of a surface and so forth. So that's also kind of an interesting thing that I noticed with this work. At first, this work was a complete response to the imagery that was sort of being spread about what a COVID virus actually looks like. And you get these fantastic images that are very colorful, very playful, very weird, very alien. Of course, we're talking about like looking at things that we can't see with our actual eyes, and sort of playing with that idea, and then sort of generating my own COVIDs by collecting things that I would see on walks, and then scanning them in with very high resolution on the photo scanner, and sort of transforming them into these sort of other worldly things, which are kind of like what we see viruses, or what viruses can kind of seem like, because we can't see them, but they're also a threat at the same time. So this just shows some of the process. So I would take these objects, most of them were natural, but not all of them. I did use candies for some of them, but transforming sort of these everyday sort of natural things that we are part of our environment. And of course, all these things come from the environment here in the inland Northwest, and then transforming them into these sort of otherworldly, alien, virusy type things, and matching them up with hands that I also scanned that also represent, of course, I used all the people around me that I had access to, which included my family. So that's the other thing I do, is I always somehow manage to include my family into my art projects, and they are all willing participants, but I'm never sure if they really quite ever get to see the results of it. But they're always willing, and I'm always making them do weird things. So the hands do represent people that I had was in close proximity with due to the lockdown. I spent a few months of that time with my sister and her family. And so the hands that are sort of representative here also come from that experience. But just to kind of tie it up quickly, these viruses, they're not necessarily bad, and they're not necessarily good. I was just really thinking about the idea of threat, and this of course extended to the idea of the virus being a threat, but also because of Black Lives Matter, that all of a sudden systemic racism is also a threat, and also I see as a virus, that we are infected with this this virus of white supremacist culture and systemic racism. And so sort of asking the question of, you know, what is a bigger threat here? You know, an actual virus that we can eventually overcome with various mitigation methods and science. But how do we eradicate racism? How do we actually deal with that particular threat? And then that idea actually also extended into sort of a more just general thought of an idea of a virus, the idea of culture, the idea of developing who we are as people, and that we all carry our viruses that either prevent us from accomplishing things or allow us to accomplish things, that we carry things within us, that maybe unspoken things, you know, that hold us back, or that there's these kind of hidden things that actually make us stronger. So just thinking about the idea of viruses like being particular to a person, and sort of representing their own sort of history and their own struggles or privileges or not privilege. So that's kind of how all this sort of wraps together. There's like a lot of stuff in there, but in the end, these images just became very playful, colorful, and became like almost just sort of a visual obsession. Like I really found a lot of joy in making these images, and a lot of joy also in trying to find the right sort of virus for the hands that were there. So I kind of did a really quick summation of this work, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. The titles are also all from COVID. Of course, like everybody was reading everything you possibly could during the pandemic on the COVID virus and so forth. So a lot of the titles come from these terms that are used to talk about the virus in medical or scientific terms. And they also kind of fit with the people that are actually end up in the images. And then the other piece that in the show is just an animation. And originally I was just going to show this, and this was also just a result of teaching animation to digital art students and teaching completely online, and just having a year of doing demonstrations and figuring out how to really fine-tune assignments so that they can translate in an online format. And this is the result of a demonstration for a animation project from my digital art class, where students have to create an imaginary landscape and then animate it as if the viewer is in a vehicle of some kind moving through the landscape, so that they understand simulating movement with 2D animation. And this piece is, I drew it completely from memory and represents where I grew up in the Okanagan Highlands, and just sort of the monotony and the repetitiveness of living in that environment, where seasons just continuously come and go, and routines come and go, and like your existence there is all based on sort of this continuous repetition of certain things. So I included this work too. The title of the show, At the Edges, sort of tying in the work of Austin, Katie, and myself, is sort of representative of ideas that sort of exist at the edges of things, whether that it is at the edge of sort of emotional disaster, at the edge of political disaster, at the edge of environmental disaster, and even at the edge of living somewhere like the Okanagan Highlands, which is sort of the edge of, it's the middle of nowhere. So it's kind of on the edges. So that sort of concludes my talk. I kind of wanted to wrap it up quickly because I wanted to leave some time for some questions or discussion, either from all of you or amongst Katie, Austin, and myself. So I'm just going to stop sharing and just open it up to just talk.
I have something that I could ask for Katie. I was just wondering, the piece that you showed that was all blue, I think it was called De Rentuin or something like that. I probably pronounced it wrong. I was wondering what the title means or where you got that from. And then I was wondering also if you could talk about the cameo process.
Yeah, sure. That it's just Dutch for zoo. So it's just all of these animals coming together. So just playing on that kind of Delft background of the work. And then the cameo process for me, if you're familiar with screen printing and emulsion, it's I do an emulsion process where I use an inkjet transparency. So I'll do like those animals I just drew on my iPad, printed them out on an inkjet transparency as a negative and made an emulsion that's kind of like a fruit roll-up emulsion. So it's on a clear piece of plastic and then you stick it down on the glass and peel off the back. And then you have that as a resist for sandblasting. So I sandblast that pattern in and take off. What I'm using is called flashed glass, and that's glass, white glass with it doesn't have to be white, but white glass with a thin layer of color on top, so I can blast through it fairly quickly and get that kind of graphic image.
So it starts with the blue on top and then you sandblast away to the white.
That's right, yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Austin, I was wondering about your use of digital work as, kind of, I know that you're not reliant on analog necessarily, but like the eraser tool and the numbered piece, where you're erasing out the head, and it's just so very like, I don't know, like that tool, you know what I mean? And
Dumb.
Yeah, that you're not that you're not denying that, but is the drawing done on the iPad too? And you're just like messing around with the tools?
Yeah, so like that piece particularly, I just drew direct on the iPad, and I'm like working from photographs that I'm looking at, obviously, but that one it's got a pen tool, and there's even kind of a screen cover that you can get that has a texture similar to paper, so it slows down the pencil and feels a little bit more like paper. And then there's just all those different brushes. I haven't really like had enough patience with it yet, because originally when I bought it I was like, oh, that'll be great for my travel to do color studies or try to do more plein air stuff, and I was thinking like, after traveling in Europe, I was on these trains and there were these like fancy Italian business suit guys looking at me like, what the hell are you doing? Because I would have my little brushes and all my kits out and like spilling paint all over the trains and stuff, which I guess there's a place for that. But yeah, I thought, oh, I'll do this digital work. I haven't figured out how to make it work like in a way that feels painterly or that doesn't feel real digital, but I know that there's a lot of different brushes and stuff that you can try. The pencil one I have been pretty happy with, but then at the same time it's like, why don't I just carry a sketch pad? It's not that much more involved than carrying an iPad. But yeah, it does feel different. And then I think I've just tried to be open to working in a lot of different ways. Like sometimes I'll draw something, and I think maybe it was really when I studied printmaking as an undergraduate that I started to think about images differently, because sometimes you'd be like tracing an image on the tracing table, or like using collage and like looking at it as a means to an end. And also through lithography, this was actually one of the reasons why I really fell in love with it, is you get to make the image, but you see it in so many different stages, which made me think about my narratives and the aesthetics and the way that it could develop in a different way. So yeah, eraser tool. And then I think I also have this push-pull, or maybe it's like a love-hate thing where like I like to craft things nicely, but I'm also extremely impatient. So I think that's maybe where there's like, sometimes I can sit down and do it, and other times I'm like just attacking my work, or what, maybe that's what the eraser head was. I probably drew the face and didn't like it.
You know, I like to say about Jenny that she's gets up from the computer and she's all covered in charcoal. I don't know how she does it. You're both doing that though. You're both like, you get messy with the machine. It's kind of fun. Not necessarily, more in the Okanagan piece, you know, where you get like your layers going than in the scan pieces.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Austin, one thing I have to say is I do actually really enjoy the evidence of the digital tool in those, because there's something important about the erasure, I feel like, in your figures right now. Like there's even the figure in the, I think the Red Threat piece, where it's like his face is like not there, and it's like there's a baby deer or something back there. But I feel like there is this erasure or partial, you know, like your figures are being almost dismembered, or in a weird way, like they're existing in two different places at once, and we only get to see one aspect of it. We're only in one dimension while they're partially in a different dimension. That's sort of how I see like also the threshold piece, where the figure is escaping something, either escaping or trying to escape. So I'm just wondering, I have a question. I know it might be, I don't know, it might be a hard question, but I think I talked about this briefly, but I'm just curious about your position as a white man. And how do you make work right now? Like what, like in terms of the content, I feel like your content is very fraught. There is a lot of, I feel a lot of tension in the work. And I think I don't know, I'm just posing a question, or I'm trying to maybe put something clumsily together, but do you have thoughts on that? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think it's a lot easier probably to, I don't know, I just can't help myself in terms of the work that I want to make, you know, and what I feel like is pertinent for me to speak about. Of course, it comes from my experience. So like, I'm sure that there are many instances in my narratives about global social dynamics where I'm like being an idiot about it, right? Because I don't know everything. I'm not an expert on political science or anything like that. But ultimately, like, nobody really knows, right? It's just like a big mess. And I just try to let my work, I guess I have thought about that a lot, because it is sort of scary. Like there's a lot of call out culture, and there's always the fear that like somebody's gonna say, hey, you're not qualified to talk about that thing. So I try not to be like an asshole about it, but also it's just like, yeah, the whole thing's a big mess, and there's nobody really knows what's going on in contemporary society. And I think maybe that's what I'm trying to make my work speak to let it coalesce in that place of it being problematic, and like being okay with that.
yeah.
And because it's like, I make my work is somewhat political, but I don't want it at the end of the day for somebody to walk away from it and being like, that's the Democratic Party agenda. Like, I think that's too narrow, you know, like I want to present it in ways that are problematic. And I didn't show any images of this, but I have an image, you know, of a guy on the beach walking down, and there's wind turbines that are exploding, you know. And for me, it's like, I have thought a lot about that. Like when somebody sees that, are they going to think that I'm like a Trumper that's like, screw green energy, you know, which I'm not really, but it's just like, I like that complexity to it, and that if it can be read in multiple ways, and if people have to think about it and not in a narrow context, I think that's why I like a lot of the layers.
Yeah.
I have a comment.
Yeah, go for it.
It's not a question, it's a comment, but I like regarding the sort of like crude aspects in your paintings, like using the eraser tool or in the red thread piece with like the tube of paint, I think that there's like an element of humor that you're not like directly talking about. But I think like having these like exquisitely drawn figures and like landscapes, and then just like taking a tube of paint and like spewing it right on top of the like really labored work, I think like pushes it into like an almost like slapstick sort of space. And like I don't know what your intention with it is, but like when I look at the work, I do think there's like an element of poking fun at yourself.
That's probably a good read. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's
I
intentional,
mentioned a little
but
bit
it's just like
before
a thing that I think.
I'm like essentially a perfectionist who has like no patience with myself. So it's a bad mix. And I think that probably leads to just doing drastic stuff occasionally. Like I feel a little bit inconsistent. And I don't feel like I don't have the patience to do photorealism painting. I like I love those paintings that are like so technically detailed and stuff, but I feel like, yeah, I guess I like to do a little bit of both worlds. Thank you for the comment. Brad, I think I saw you trying to jump in there, Brad, weren't you?
Well, I don't remember what I was gonna ask, but just what Anne was asking made me think about, I think one response that I often have with your work is that, and I haven't always thought of this overtly, but I was just kind of realizing it, is that, you know, you're such a good drawer and painter, just technically, you're really good with the figure, and your drawings look like you're the kind of guy that could just whip out a figure in, you know, no time, anytime you wanted. And maybe that's not true, but that's the impression I get from your work. So when I see you doing these kind of bold marks and erasures, I think I kind of read it as a response against that technical skill that you have, almost like a counterbalance to all those skills you've amassed.
That's an interesting
About that.
read.
Like almost a little bit of a, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what grad school did to me.
It's almost like I see you, you know, you make this really well-drawn thing, and then part of you says, ah, and you just kind of like get rid of some of it or paint over it, or, and I don't know why I think that, but.
Well, it's awesome to be perfect, I guess, but it's also a little boring, you know? Like I think that it's more important to be exciting and to be daring in a way. I'm not saying that that's what I am or that's what my work is, but like I struggle with that because sometimes I look at other painters' work and it's like, wow, it's so buttoned up, it's so amazing, but ultimately sometimes it's just boring. As how like it's more interesting to see something a little bit more real or complicated and beautiful and ugly at the same time.
And then it was interesting to hear you reference abstract expressionism too, which is, you know, sort of a flip side of what you do, or an opposite in a way, you know. Though you obviously like mark making, and, you know.
Yeah. That's all I've allowed myself to do, is to be like, okay, because I'm ultimately afraid of abstract painting in a way. Like if I were to just go abstract, I feel like I would, because I've built up my identity around this other type of thing, right? And it's kind of hard to abandon that. But I have like referenced it in other ways. So we'll see. Maybe if I'm in the long haul when I get to my late work, let myself.
Yeah, you're still young.
Thanks for the comment. Jenny, I wanted to ask you something about your, Ava, were you gonna go?
Oh,
I just
you're
had a
up.
comment
Oh.
about Jenny's work. When you talked about viruses being present, and that sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, it made me start thinking about balance, and balances within your body, even like of good bacteria and bad bacteria, and they're all good, but when they get out of balance, it spurs us to do something. And so then when you were talking about like Black Lives Matter, and so sometimes the like abundance of something spurs action.
Mhm.
And so we may not take care of something within our bodies until it gets out of balance. And then we call and say, oh, I'm having this thing. And, but also in society, when it gets, it's kind of good when it gets out of balance, because then it spurs us on to action. And so I appreciate you sharing that perspective, because it got me to think about things a little bit differently and get some thoughts rolling about that.
Well,
So that's all.
yeah, I mean, I actually have to thank Katie for giving me ideas about that work, because I think she actually nailed it. She talks about it better than I can. When you were explaining it, yeah, when you were explaining it to your students, I was like, oh yeah, that's what that's about. I can, yeah. That's why it's important to keep your artist friends around. But well, I think we've gone over our hour, but I want to thank Austin and Katie both for participating in this exhibition, and I really appreciate your work, and I think it's important work. I think it's good work, and I'm really proud to have shown work with you, the two of you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
it's-
all of you.
It's
Appreciate it.
mutual.
Yeah.
Thank you for your work, Jenny, and thanks
Yeah.
for including me.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys, I'm sure you're all really excited about going to whatever next Zoom meeting you have planned.
No, this was so lovely. It's so lovely to hear all of you talk about process, and like to be able to kind of peek behind the curtain and understand the thought process. And Jenny, I love the photos of like the natural materials that you use to help create some of those
Mhm.
pieces. It's just always interesting to me to be able to see that. So thank you, all of you, for talking about the work in such a thoughtful way.
Of course. Yeah. All right. Yep.
Thank you all.
Yep.
Thank you for the comments and questions.
Yep. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.